guys, and welcome to Future Proof. We are here today with Ruth Holloway, and Ruth is a mid-level developer, is that correct? Working for cPanel in Texas, Houston, Texas. But I think probably the most interesting thing about Ruth is she's an unbelievable keynote speaker talking about probably one of the hottest topics at the moment, which is empathy. Welcome, Ruth, to Future Proof.
Thanks.
So first of all, Ruth, I would love to ask you, tell us, because you work in the tech world, but you've also got this soft heart and you're teaching others how to be more empathetic, yeah? Okay, so Ruth, tell us about the trends you're observing around the future of work and the impacts of technology based on, the space that you're in.
Well, I've had a 30-year career in IT, and in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s when I started, you still saw developers as people who were in the back room. They were hidden away from the real world that they were affecting, and people were writing these requirements documents, involved, detailed documents of what to write so that the developer didn't have to understand the problem. These days, as fast as technology moves, that process is just too binding. It takes too long. It puts too many people in the middle. We need developers who can get out with their stakeholders to understand the problems that they're trying to solve, and then solve them immediately, rather than having these intermediate phases of documenting and designing and figuring out. We need those problem solvers to get out there and immediately do the whole thing. So you see advertisements for full stack developers. That's people who can design and develop and understand the problems and debug all the way through the technologies that are needed to solve the problem.
So it's a broader skill set than just sitting there and writing code, isn't it?
It is, very much so.
So you've just delivered a keynote on empathy in front of over 2,000 people here in Amsterdam for the amazing bookings.com, which is how we met, because we've both been speakers at the same conference. Talk to us about why did you start doing keynotes on empathy? Why is this important to you?
Well, I started originally with a talk about codes of conduct in open source communities and how we need those in order to help prevent the problems that are unfortunately rampant in the tech trade. We've had a lot of problems of sexism and racism and other kind of exclusionary behaviors going on for decades. And codes of conduct are one of the methods we're using to address those problems. They popped up in lots of other spaces as well, such as science fiction fandom and anime fandom. But in technology, there's a specific value to having those creative people included rather than excluded.
Yeah.
And so I started talking about that last year at a couple of different conferences, and kind of came to realize that it's about empathy. It's about wrapping your head around somebody else's and understanding what's going on in their head to be able to help prevent those problems. That this behavior, this negative behavior that we dealt with for so long, is an unempathetic behavior. And to deal with that, then we have these tools, but the broader problem is still there. And so addressing that, I think, is where there's a lot of value. And in the case of here at Booking.com, I was asked to talk about that. And so rather than kind of the talk about open source communities that I'd been doing, I kind of had to broaden it out to a larger business audience, a non-technical audience, many of them. And it went over very well. I was really pleased.
So, as empathy is so topical at the moment, it is one of the key skills for the future, they say, in order to be able to thrive in the future of work and really amplify what makes us human, yeah? So talk to me, how would you define empathy, first of all?
Empathy, and I define it in my talk as understanding the emotions that somebody else is going through.
Yeah.
And there are multiple types of empathy. If you see someone hit themselves on the hand with a hammer, your own brain lights up in the same way theirs does. Science shows us this. Now, it doesn't feel the same because the pain receptors in your hand don't fire because you didn't hit yourself. But we understand that sensation because all of us have done it. The emotional empathy that comes when someone you know is going through something you've been through, whether positive or negative, like buying a house or losing a family member or loss of a pet. We understand those emotions because all of us, by the time we're adults, have done that. We've all been there. And so that emotional empathy is the second kind of empathy. And then third, there's the kind of intellectual empathy of, I see that these people are in a situation that I perceive as bad, and so I can understand that. And empathy leads to sympathy and compassion as expressions of that empathy.
So now talk to us about empathy in the context of your life, yeah, and the challenges that you've faced. So how are you using empathy to future-proof your happiness? Yeah, because this is all about, I talk a lot about how we can future-proof in a world full of uncertainty and unknowns, and empathy being so important. How are you using it to future-proof your happiness?
That's complicated.
Yeah,
Wow,
I know.
this is really hard.
But I mean, you've got a beautifully interesting story. You know, you from us meeting have overcome some unbelievable adversity, and you're still suffering. I would say at the hands of idiots is probably the nicest thing I could say on a daily basis. You know, who are not accepting of people who may be slightly different. You know, from the norm. So I'm intrigued. One, in terms of, you know, this is very important to you for a reason, but how are you using empathy to make your life better?
The first and most important piece of empathy is to understand yourself.
Yeah.
To be kind to yourself is the hardest thing for a lot of us. I think
Yeah.
most people really struggle with being kind to themselves. And that, understanding that, I think, is the first step to making yourself in a long-term way, kind of future-proofing yourself against unhappiness and making yourself happy in an ongoing way. Understanding yourself in deep introspection. The process of being a transgender person, as currently done by medical care, requires a period of very deep introspection. I have examined my soul much more closely than a great many people ever do. And I had to get to where I am. And I think that unless you are transgender, you can't fully grasp the process. You can't really wrap your head around the whole thing. And so many people say, well, this is really brave, or this was really an overwhelming process. As you said, to us it was not. To me it was not. To many transgender people, and I've heard this over and over again, it was a necessity.
Yeah.
It was as necessary as a sunrise that we do this, because the other choice is misery. And so there's no choice to it. It's who we are. And so this process is what you have to do. So I look at it as just something I had to do. So having done that introspection, I understand what drives me. I understand what drives my emotions. And that gives me that capability of setting up resistances to the negatives and kind of future-proofing for happiness.
Interesting. And it said that you know, empathy is about you said better understanding yourself, yeah? And I think the other overlay for me around that is, once you understand yourself, it's accepting yourself. You know, self-acceptance is, like you say, I think so many people don't understand themselves. But then when they do, if you can't accept who you are, warts and all, you know, because we all have good bits and we all have bad bits, it's very hard to live a happy and fulfilled life. So how then, if someone is obviously, and I find this so weird, because empathy is one of those things that a lot of us either have or don't have. I don't know, that's how I kind of feel about it. But it's something that is becoming touted as a real skill in the future. So if someone wants to improve their empathy, yeah, and really hone this skill, what would be sort of your top tips for becoming more empathetic?
This has all been covered in lots of different pieces in many places, but so some of this may sound like bits you've picked up elsewhere along the way. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. The power of listening is the strongest message of empathy. The strongest tool to build empathy is to listen, to learn how to listen to people. And Brene Brown from University of Houston, you and I have talked about her. She says that the core message of empathy is you are not alone. And too many of us, even when we're with someone we care about very deeply, or someone we know who is struggling, we still put ourselves as alone, and we let them be alone. The core message of empathy is you are not alone. Let that person know that they are not alone. And there it sits. Don't judge on top of it. Don't add to it. Don't pile on your own expectations or your own experiences. Just let them know that core message. You are not alone. That is the key to empathy. And it really is just that simple.
I think you're wonderful. You said you're complex. I think wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today,
Thank you.
and all the very best with your speaking.
Thanks.
Cheers.